Welcome to this bonus episode of Strategy Simplified. Today, we're joined by two consultants from Altman Solon, the world's leading TMT strategy consultancy. On this episode, they walk us through the different pieces of a case, how they evaluate candidates in the interview process, and end by walking us through a full case study. You're not going to want to miss it. Welcome, everybody, to this exciting case prep session, sponsored and hosted by Altman Solon. I'm so excited that you're able to join us today. And without further ado, Toby, I will turn it over to you to take us away.
Thank you, Naman. My name is Toby. I'm a consultant out of the Boston office here at Altman Solon. I'm joined from a distant New York City with my colleague, Annabelle Chung. She's also a consultant here in the New York office. The both of us are pretty well positioned to help guide you through this session, as we both spend a lot of time recruiting and interviewing folks. So we're both well positioned, and we're excited to help walk folks through a good case prep session, as well as give a bit introduction to some of the roles that we're hiring for. So with that in mind, Naman touched on this earlier, but we're Altman Solon. We're a tech, media, and telecom strategy and management consultant firm based out of, at least in North America, is based out of the Boston offices, with offices and open positions in Boston, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Internationally, we have a number of offices across Europe, as well as two in APAC. While there are open positions across all of these offices, this session at least will focus on the North America application process, but know that it's very similar to that in sort of all the offices, and those roles can be found on the Altman Solon website. The three positions that we are hiring for, as Naman referenced, are the consultant, the senior consultant, and the manager. Consultant tends to be 2 to 4 years of experience, post-undergraduate, pre-MBA. Senior consultant is you have an MBA or an advanced degree under your belt and maybe 1 or so years of experience, typically some type of management experience. And then lastly, there's the manager role, which is post-MBA or graduate degree role with a couple of years of additional experience as well. So we're going to want to spend a couple minutes today at least walking through what you should expect in a case interview, why we sort of use case interviews as a method to test applicants, and how you are going to be likely scored on that, and then how to really succeed in those case interviews to make sure that you're sort of hitting all of the points that we're looking for. So the first thing that I do want to underscore is case interviews really shouldn't be stressful. The way I like to think about them is as a problem that we're going to work through together. I try to make my case interviews that I lead as interactive and collaborative as possible. I don't want to put any applicants in any type of stressful position. People should never go into a case interview afraid or sort of nervous. I think it's a great opportunity to say, hey, I've put in a lot of prep. I'm excited to show that off, and I'm excited to work through a fun business problem that some of our clients might be facing. And so that's at least the lens that I view case studies with, and I hope that applicants sort of treat it the same way. So I think the first question then becomes, why use case interviews, right? What's the importance of actually using a case interview in an interview process, and what does it really test for? So it tests for a number of things, with the high level summary being it tests for a lot of the things that we do in our day-to-day job. So we're trying to understand your intellectual curiosity. We're trying to understand your analytical ability. Are you able to not necessarily long divide a bunch of crazy numbers together, because that's not what we do on a day-to-day basis, but are you able to sense check orders of magnitude and understand when you arrive at an answer that might not sound sort of correct and might be a bit off and worth double checking? We're trying to understand, are you able to think logically and organize your answers and walk through sort of a structured approach and lead to an answer? We want to be able to observe your thought process, right? Are you the kind of person that's going to keep your cards very close to your chest once you hear the sort of case prompt, go off, spend 5 minutes trying to do a bunch of math, and then say, yes, the answer is $100 billion. That's not necessarily what we're looking for. We want to understand how you got there, right? $100 million is probably never the answer. And even if it is the answer, I'd rather you get $95 million, but me understand every single step that led you there rather than just the single right answer at the end. And then in terms of the last two, we want to understand how comfortable you are with ambiguity. Is it the kind of thing where once you get potentially deviated from your original path, does that really throw off your confidence? And are you able to sort of push forward and take and adapt to sort of the new information that comes up? And lastly, consulting is by nature of it. It's a service industry. We work with our clients and we work with folks where we have to communicate an answer. And an analysis is only as good as your ability to communicate it as, right? You can have the most technical, impressive model that takes in hundreds of thousands of inputs and takes hours to run and all these things. But if you're unable to communicate that clearly and concisely to a client, then in the end, what was the point, right? And so we want to understand how well you are able to communicate all of those things. So that's at least what the purpose of the case interview is. In terms of what we're looking for and how you're evaluating, especially at Altman Solon, we look for sort of four main tenets, right? You're going to be scored on your analytical ability. Are you able to do some quick maths in your head and arrive at an answer that seems sensical? Again, it's never anything crazy where you're moving decimal places over or anything like that. It tends to be pretty standard case math, but it is important to show that you have that analytical horsepower to be able to accomplish those sense checks that we do on a day-to-day basis in our jobs. Secondarily, we want to understand your business intuition. Are you able to probe on a profitability case beyond just revenues and costs? Do you have some own insight from your own experience about further questions that might be worth answering, right? Or getting answered in that mind? And then in terms of your tolerance for ambiguity, we want to understand how much we can push you in a direction or shape your answer and how you sort of take that feedback and work with it. And then lastly, communication skills. We'll certainly be trying to get an understanding of how strong of a communicator you are. Does your experience prior lead to really strong business intuition through great analytical expertise to lead to an answer that you're finally able to communicate pretty well? So that's at least how we evaluate it on our side. But this shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to folks, because I think that's what you end up trying to prepare for in a case interview, is being able to walk through, can I get through the maths of the interview? Can I prove that I'm able to show some knowledge around this interview? And what types of questions are being asked of me? Am I able to show that I can take in new information and adapt my answer? And then am I able to communicate all of that effectively? In terms of what are the typical types of cases, there are usually three. The first one's sort of this classic back of the envelope. I'm in Boston, so I'm partial to this question. How many gas stations are there in Boston? The classic is the sort of how many ping pong balls fit in a Boeing airliner, right? These are things that are incredibly open-ended. They tend to be working from sort of big to small in your answer, to try to take haircuts on haircuts on haircuts, that kind of thing. While helpful, it's not necessarily the standard that we use in our cases, just because we'd rather probe for some specific knowledge that, especially in our business, relates more specifically to the TMT ecosystem. The second one is a classic market sizing. Let's take a market. In this case, let's look at the percent of pizza market that we could capture if we open up a new pizza restaurant in New York City. Annabelle would love that she's based there. But those questions are looking at trying to arrive at a dollar figure, right? How much is something worth? How much could we realistically capture? And while a series of our cases do involve components of market sizings, I would say that they're not always going to be a market size. And also a market size might just be sort of part of it. You might arrive at a market size and then try to then work through to a profitability. And then the last one is what our focus is today and the way that we tend to interview, which is around general business cases. And so these are problems that are taken from real life sort of client opportunities that we've worked on. The cases that I tend to give are based specifically off of projects that I've worked on. Granted, everything is masked from a confidentiality perspective, but it allows for me to have a really strong and robust back and forth with candidates who are really strong. So the strong candidate is able to work through the classics of a case interview, but they ask those sort of secondary and tertiary questions that really get into the meat of the case. And so while that might not necessarily be on my page in terms of I'm not prepared for these questions systematically, I'm able to actually rely on the fact that, yeah, we did this, and there probably is an answer to that question from our real life experience. And so that's one of the things we like to do at Altman Solon, is just making sure that all of our cases are really grounded in real life situations or hypothetical situations that we might have worked adjacent to. So that at least lays out the landscape for sort of why case interviews, how we use case interviews, how you're going to be tested and evaluated through your use of case interviews, and then what types of case interviews, with the focus being on this last one, the business case. with that in mind, we'll now spend some time working through a case in real time with folks. Annabelle's going to lead us here. So Annabelle, you want to take us away then?
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Toby. So as Toby laid out, we have like 3 different types of cases usually, but no matter what type of problem you're kind of presented with, there are, I think, 7 pretty standard things that you can take and like be in control of as you're walking through the case that'll really help your performance overall. So let's just walk through these together before you dive in. The first is just like listen and verbalize the problem statement. So at the beginning of every case, your interviewer is typically going to like lay out the business situation, give you additional information that you might need about what's going on in the market, or, like maybe competitors that might be entering. It can definitely get overwhelming because it's a long blurb, right? And you might be like, even though this is meant to be a collaborative process, there might still be some nerves. That being said, really feel free to just take notes, ask like, oh, could you please repeat what you said here? Let's just like make sure that we're on the same page about like what we're trying to like work through together. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to just clarify the objectives and ask any additional questions. So typically, as Toby mentioned, our cases are very TMT focused. Not that many of you might be like in the know with the TMT industry. So, if we're talking about like a cloud services market, you could be like, what even is a cloud services provider? Some other things that we use, for example, terminology wise, might be like churn or like ARPU. And those things, once you like know the definition, you might be able to factor it into your math. But obviously going into some like very industry specific problem, it can be a bit unnerving. So really feel free to like ask any questions that you might have about like terminology. We're really here to help you and like walk through this process together.
So the one thing I'll add there, if you don't mind me jumping in, Annabelle, and I think you touched on it at the end there, is we're meant to help folks through case interviews. Treat us as a resource. And at no point are you ever going to get I'm never going to write a note on my side saying, oh, Annabelle asked too many questions. She's like somehow getting a mark there. I would rather a candidate ask a lot of questions and get a really thorough understanding of the sort of problem that we're working through before we work through it. So certainly ask those questions.
Yeah, definitely. And moving on, once you get the business problem, I think it's really important to take a moment and structure and communicate your thoughts. Because, right, you've been presented this problem. There could be many factors that might be driving into like, why is a company seeing like decreasing market share, for example? And it's just helpful for like kind of you to just prep in terms of how you're going to go through the case, to say, okay, like just give me a minute. I'm going to write down my ideas, lay it out in a very organized way. And then you can like kind of convey your thoughts to the interviewer so that it's easy to follow on both ends. From there, as you're brainstorming, you'll probably have some questions that pop up, right? So you should always ask for relevant information. Sometimes, you're expected to kind of make assumptions as you work through a certain problem, but other times the interview will have the data to really help you like go through an analysis together. And just like don't be hesitant again to ask for any additional data that you think might be helpful and you trying to figure out like what's going on with the business. And then as we move on through the case, there will most likely be a quantitative section as well. And so it's really, again, important to just kind of walk through the interview through your analysis. There's this expectation that you need to kind of, there might be an expectation where you need to like mentally calculate like, oh, I got to multiply this thousands number times this like millions number and then produce like, get my zeros right and whatever. Like really not the case. Feel free to just like take a step back, be like, okay, first I'm going to calculate, profitability by this. Here are the drivers to profitability. Let me walk you through how I'm going to like, maybe like segment like this like market this way and then calculate the profitability that way. Just like laying out each step, I think really helps like the interviewer like stay on track with you, right? And if by any chance you might be taking it in a different direction, then the interview is like, oh, like, so why are you thinking on this way? Why not this other way? So it's like really meant again to help you kind of stay on track and make sure that you're both working towards like that same goal of figuring out what's going on. And then lastly, I think 6 and 7 go hand in hand. Once you've like kind of gone through a case, it's important to kind of summarize the case. Like we found that this market size is going to be like really profitable. And for like these 3 reasons that we just discussed. So like laying out concisely like what you found as if you're kind of like, presenting the key takeaways to a client. And then it's a short case, right? It's in some ways going to be like simplified. And so thinking of like, if I was this business and I really had to like deal with this problem, what would I want to look at next? So I think just like listing areas that you'd really want to like look more into if you had time is always like a great thing that kind of helps you just like be engaged like throughout the case and really just thinking about the problem in general. So without further ado, we have a case prepared for you guys. And I think it'll be helpful to kind of like walk through this together with each of the steps that we kind of laid out. So our client is going to be, as you can see, the head of product development at Amazon. And the client has requested assistance exploring the potential of Amazon to enter like this meal kit delivery space. So I will leave you guys to read the meal kit delivery background because that is long. But once you've taken a moment to kind of read through kind of the scenario, would love to see, what kind of what kind of questions come up to your mind that you want to clarify in terms of objectives. Yeah, so we'll give a bit.
We'll be right back after this quick break.
Have you ever heard a new digital trend and thought to yourself, okay, does this really matter? Asking the right questions helps you cut through the noise and get down to what matters most. I'm Jim Hertzfeld, host of the What If, So What podcast, where we discover what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real by asking what if, so what, and most importantly, now what? Subscribe and listen, and together we can turn big ideas into tangible actions so you can get shit done.
One question for you, Annabelle, as folks are sort of reading this through. Is it okay if, as a candidate, I sort of miss a sentence and just ask you to repeat that? Is that necessary?
100%. 100%. Yeah. We want you to like ask. Like we don't want you to kind of feel nervous that like, oh, I missed like whatever she said, but it's okay. I'm gonna power through it. No, like we really want you to like make sure you're very well equipped with the background information that we provide, like going into this case. So really don't feel hesitant at all.
Makes sense. And one note that I will also say for folks is the way I think about this is Annabelle in a case interview would be hitting us with quite a fair deal of information here, right? You're not going to want to try and take verbatim notes, but you're going to want to capture sort of the most important parts here in terms of Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, Blue Apron's role, calling out some of those data points that we see there in terms of either 2-person or 4-person, and those kits being delivered either 2 times or 4 times a week. Those are the data points that you'll certainly want to take down on your sheet to make sure that you're capturing, because my money is on that they're likely going to come back later in the case. So to Annabelle's question, what are some of these questions that sort of come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking really at the deep level of like the food ingredients, like perishables, like are we just looking kind of like easy things to ship versus things that are more time sensitive before the food expires? Yeah, what quantifies success? Why do they even want to enter this market? Geographical conditions, size, timeline. Yeah, these are exactly really helpful questions that I think also helps just you get in the zone to like really think about this problem from like the client's shoes and like trying to think about the business overall.
There are a couple questions in here that almost ask sort of in which direction the case is going. There's some questions in terms of what are the associated costs of what are some of the revenues. If you ever end up, and it's totally fair to ask those questions because there might be some cases where that's going to be given information. But there are some sort of other questions, or there are other cases where that might be the case itself. So don't be off put if your interviewer is also saying, great question, we're going to come back to that. That certainly is not our sort of quiet way of saying bad question. It is a very good question. It just likely means that, oh, you're probably going to actually be working through that calculation with us. So with that, a lot of great questions coming in.
Yeah, that's great. So now that we've like kind of clarified, the objectives and asked like really good questions that I've seen in this chat, the next step that we're talking about is, first coming up and like structuring your approach, asking like any additional questions that you think are relevant to, help you go in a path in your approach to like really drill down on, and then walking the interviewer through your analysis. So if you go to the next slide, like maybe the interviewer might ask, okay, can you list for me like the general business considerations that you'd want to like think about as you develop the strategy? So again, would love to hear your thoughts in the chat. How would you kind of approach sizing or approach this problem?
Yeah, general business considerations is sort of the classic kickoff of any case, which is, and we've seen a lot of these questions come through in terms of, I won't give away any hints, but a lot of the questions that folks are asking hit on what are some of those business considerations. So we can continue to drop those in the chat, but that's sort of the classic beginning of any case. Blank sheet of paper, what are all the considerations out there? One thing I will note, a lot of awesome answers. When it comes to frameworking and things like that, frameworks are incredibly important and are a way to really succeed in cases. But I would steer away from just sort of overtly calling them out and saying, I'm going to use this framework, or I'm going to look at it in this lens. It's perfectly fine to reference like what those things are, but I would just steer away from it seeing a bit over-engineered and just using a specific framework. But I will come back to saying frameworks are important, but I just sort of keep them to yourself rather than just going out and saying, hey, I'm going to use this framework for this case for this reason.
And just to kind of piggyback off of Toby, the frameworks are definitely helpful for you to kind of like, have in your back pocket and be like, okay, these are some of the general things that might help to look at. But again, just want to kind of emphasize that every business is unique and every business problem is also going to be different. So sometimes just applying like your standard framework may not make the most sense. So really take the time to kind of, as you're laying out your approach, be like, like would this actually be worth looking into in this like 30, 35-minute case? Yeah, so I think a lot of these were kind of mentioned already, but, some of the example answers. So the first one would just be like, what's the value prop? How can Amazon differentiate their product? Separately, like what does the market look like? We like touched on like that there's Blue Apron, there's HelloFresh, there's all these like competitors. So how would Amazon fare? Then, understanding the customers, like which customers might even be like most likely to kind of like subscribe to this kind of service, thinking about like channels, marketing, etc. So that's like level one. Just like your basic framework where you like kind of say at a high level, these are like maybe the 5 drivers or 5 factors that I'd look into. And then maybe drilling in and being more specific is really helpful as well. Just like I found that some of the cases that I really enjoyed kind of working with is when someone really gets like into the weeds of a business. I mean, like, like I really think in terms of just like this food grocery and like meal kit plan business, really factoring in like consumers' preferences in general. How can they like stand out? Like what would make them like different from Blue Apron? I actually subscribe to Blue Apron and I've seen like, the pros of Blue Apron, but the cons of Blue Apron. So kind of like even bringing in your personal experience if you have any. And this isn't necessary, but I found that it kind of helps you just get, again, more into like the zone, is really helpful in terms of completing out your thought process and like kind of going end to end in terms of what different routes that you could go through in your approach. And then, so that would be the structure. And then the next step, again, would be asking for, more clarifying questions and points on like the information that we've been provided on. So here would be like, how mature is this market? What are like potential sources for competitive advantages, disadvantages? How like even like valuable would be and profitable would this like investment be? So that would be covering steps 3 and 4.
Annabelle took the words out of my mouth in terms of bringing in your own life experiences. That's always awesome to see in a case. I will give you all the easiest tip in the world, which is, especially in sort of the environment we're living in now, a very valid question is, is this business better or worse off positioned as a function of COVID as well as a post-COVID world, right? And so there's a very easy logical step to make here in saying, oh, this is a meal delivery service for the past, say, 16, 17 months. That's probably easier than going to the grocery store, right? Is that a consideration that we want to take into account? So pulling in, regardless of whether I have I don't have Blue Apron, but I'm cognizant of the world we sort of live in and the differences that are happening in sort of the business landscape as a function of COVID-19. So even just bringing that in is a good way to draw in sort of those real world experiences into a case.
And so moving on, once you've kind of laid out your plan, you've talked about it with your interviewer, and then you're kind of ready to get more in the weeds. And so the interviewer then asks, okay, let's say we're going to just focus here on the pricing and the revenue opportunity. So, you kind of go into this case with ideas as to should we even is this market a good opportunity? Should we enter it? And then we're going to probably one of the buckets that you kind of listed out. We're going to focus more on the pricing and revenue opportunity. And so here would love to see a kind of why you think first this is important, how you'd approach assessing it, and just what are some initial things that you might have in your mind as you're going through this problem. Because typically on the job, again, we're kind of faced with a lot of unknowns. The client has presented us this problem, and then we're kind of okay, we need to figure out how to improve this business or figure out what's going on wrong. And it's one thing to just look at the data and really go through it and grind and whatever, but it's another thing to be okay, I have a hypothesis that X might be the real driver. And then digging in is really more of an effective way and time effective really to just figuring out if is that the right answer or maybe there's actually a better one that comes up as you're going through the problem. Don't be afraid to have your hypothesis be wrong. Really, it's part of the process again. It'll help you in the end. And we really enjoy seeing that.
Annabelle and I have worked together. Annabelle has seen my hypotheses be wrong all the time. So she means it in terms of it's part of the process. We'd rather see a bunch of different hypotheses than just the right hypothesis, right?
My hypotheses have always been almost always wrong too. It's fine. It's really fine.
Seeing a lot of great answers here. Seeing some stuff around cost-based pricing and value-based pricing. We'll certainly want to spend some time there. Awesome. So to that point, cost-based pricing and value-based pricing are certainly two of the ways to price. There's also a third one. So I'm curious if folks, because we're going to spend some time in pricing, are able to name some of the 3 different ways that you can price a product. So what are those different approaches to pricing strategy? Exactly. The first is competitive, right? How are our competition pricing it? If folks, I gave this tip at the beginning, if folks recall in sort of that intro, we did actually mention a price in terms of how our competitors are pricing the service. So it's always great as a candidate to bring that back and say, oh, I remember from our introduction, we noted that Blue Apron prices this at $10 per person per meal. That's a great way of showing active listening, business intuition, and being able to pull it through to the present. Second is cost-based, right? What are my costs to actually make, produce, and get this meal kit out to the customer? What is the margin that I then want to make on it? And lastly, value-based, right? How much do I think Annabelle is willing to pay for this meal delivered to her for lunch and dinner 4 times a week? Those are the 3 that will come through there. Then the sort of logical next step, right, is we've outlined these 3 approaches of pricing, and your interviewer is going to press you saying, okay, that's fantastic. You've done your research. You understand sort of the associated business intuition. But which one do you think is the one we should actually go with? So I would be curious to know, and I would very much encourage people to drop this in the chat in terms of if you were the head of product development at Amazon, what sort of pricing route or approach would you take here? Low cost or high price differentiator? Yeah. Seeing a lot of value-based and cost-based, and the classic consulting, it depends. So the answer is, what at least I as an interview am looking here for is you to sort of argue your case. I don't necessarily know that there's a right answer or a wrong answer here in terms of the 3 up there. There are merits and demerits to each. So I'm just trying to understand sort of why you think the one you picked is sort of the best idea. As sort of a follow-up question, let's say you said, okay, I'm going to go competitively and I'm going to price it under the market. I'm going to charge $8.54 per meal. Why might we be able to do that? Why might Amazon be able to sort of price it underneath the market? Operational efficiencies, scale, brand value, things like that. Yeah, if I think about the comparison in market size or sort of market cap of Amazon versus Blue Apron, one of them is a lot bigger than the other, right? And so that affords them a bit more horses, right, in the pen to really be able to potentially price things lower. Perfect. So I think that captures a lot of those good questions around pricing. Let's as a sort of a case, let's move it towards revenue then. So we're going to go the route of market pricing, and let's try to estimate the sort of total market size. What are the associated inputs or assumptions that folks would need in order to size the market? Yeah, I'm seeing population, I'm seeing households, target audience. That's sort of trying to capture that Q in the revenue opportunity in terms of a P times Q, right? Yeah, a lot of really strong answers. So if we talk about their expected revenues, and this came up earlier in terms of when we were talking through business considerations, what do we think is reasonable for them to capture, right? If we arrive at a market size, that market size is not going to be ours. We're both entering a already somewhat mature marketplace with a couple big competitors. What do we actually think is reasonable in terms of our ability to capture that? So to our point, the way we're going to think about this is on a households basis. We're going to say that there are about 20 million households in the United States, just looking at the US specifically for right now. And those have any combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 people per household. And then we're going to try to calculate the size on a rate of using that $10 per meal per person. And we can assume that all players will offer the 2 or 4 meals a week for those 2 or 4 person households. And then we'll try to assume a take rate and try to justify it. And I encourage you folks to have that pen and paper and start trying to execute on some quick analyses. Question, are we only targeting big cities or suburbs? Great question. Let's say we're targeting the full 20 million households, but we have to keep in mind not all households are the same sizes. Should we define all the pricing strategies? I think we're good to just go just the competitive approach with $10 per meal. How important is it to think out loud during this stage? I encourage candidates to be always out loud. It might just be my proclivity as a function of being very extroverted, and I always think aloud, but it just gives me as an interviewer more insight into what you're doing, so that in the case where you start going down a path that I don't necessarily want you to go down, it's very easy for me to steer you back and say, awesome considerations, let's actually consider it this way or that way instead of the way you were potentially going down.
That being said, I'm an introvert, and I just remember when I was casing, I like to just think it out on my own, just to take my time and really think about how to structure it. But again, I think it's really important to just lay out once you've thought it through on your in your head and written it down on pen and paper, just saying, okay, I'm thinking about structuring it this way. And then even then, the interviewer can be like, okay, I like how you're thinking about it, but why don't we take it a different way? So you're still keeping the interviewer in the loop. Don't feel obligated to just say okay, I'm going to structure it XYZ, this driving this. But I think the kind of key takeaway here is that do what's most comfortable for you. But I think always just make sure that when you have an approach, lay it out, and so the interviewer can be on the same page. Yeah, for sure. So there's an example structure that we've popped up on the screen here at the bottom. We can walk through this quickly, but the way we're thinking about this is we're going to look at 2-person households and 4-person households, as those are the only ones that we're necessarily considering relevant, because I don't think you'd have a 3-person household that we will, as part of the sizing that we're thinking is going to order food for 4 people. But we have to take into account that 2 times a week or 4 times a week. So if we assume sort of a uniform distribution of 10 million households, sort of that fall into each of those buckets, a 5% take rate is one of those assumptions that I think we'd press you on, but we just want a good explanation, right? 5% might be you saying, hey, I know 100 families and 100 households, and probably 4 to 7 of them might have a Blue Apron-like product. So let's assume around 5% as a take rate. That leads us to a number of total households that are taking this product.
and then an associated meals per week, with that meals per week coming from the total number of folks. So let's say 2 people times the total number of meals that they're getting a week. So in the first row, 2 times 2 is the 4. In the last row, 4 times 4 is 16. For simplicity, let's annualize this, but not necessarily say that we're going to do every week in the year. We might take a week off during Thanksgiving or Christmas season, at least in North America. And then that produces a meals per year, and then an associated dollars per year when we multiply it then by that $10 per meal per person. So this walks us through that same example structure, but how much do we think is actually somewhat reasonable to capture, right? That produces a market size in the billions on the right-hand side for each of these different household segments. What do folks, I know we have at least on the screen 40%. I'm curious to know what percent of the market folks think we can actually capture, or if they think that this 40% is reasonable. That's a great question. In a Zoom interview, would applicants be able to share their screen to walk the interviewer through the calculations, through the thought process? I've never necessarily done the share screen approach from a candidate. In some of the interviews, I actually share my screen because I present candidates with some tabulated data. I think just sort of being able to talk out loud and think that through as you're working through your steps. Most people, I'm doing it as we speak on a pen and paper. So most people have that. And it's not like we want you Vanna White holding it up against the screen, but just being able to communicate your thoughts pretty succinctly is certainly what we're looking for. 40% seems potentially a bit high, a bit aggressive. Okay, so what are some of the sort of what are some of the reasonable market captures that folks think of? A gradual scale, okay. I think these make a lot of sense. So that brings us to the end in terms of stating your conclusions, right? So we've worked through this. People are dropping some of their market shares in here. Let's say we run with that 40%, at least for the time being, and say, okay, this produces a $3.8 billion opportunity specifically for Amazon. That's a lot of money, and certainly a salivating market size, right? We'd want you to hear you sort of reason that out, walk through the steps that you got to accomplish that, what parts of the market you potentially included or excluded and why. What are some of the assumptions you made? That 5% take rate is probably something that will, if that take rate becomes 10%, right, it very quickly just doubles your market size, right? And so that's a certainly very sensitive input. So it's one of the things that you'd want to spend time thinking about. And then sort of laying out any areas we discussed potentially about pressing on a bit more. So saying, hey, we did this over the course of, 20 minutes together? Let's say we're doing this over the course of a month. What would I want to do? Well, I'd want to understand if we can try to price our meals based off of customer desire and a willingness to pay. I'd run a conjoint survey to understand where people actually associate value with food. Can we offer a premium product now that we have Whole Foods with just the best sort of organic vegetables and meats and things like that to be able to price ourselves higher to capture even higher margins? Things like that really show that business intuition, all while layering in some of the answers that you've arrived at. That's what we're looking at in sort of the conclusion stage. And with that, I think that brings us just to some final general tips from Annabelle.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap some of these points. So first, again, never hesitate to ask questions. We want you to feel comfortable and answer anything that you think might be relevant, and maybe the interviewer can help you with that. So again, don't feel afraid to kind of ask questions that come to your mind. Make sure to take a moment and just structure your approach to give yourself time to think about it and be able to lay it out in a very clear and organized way to the interviewer. That ties directly with drawing out the structure of analysis. And then as you kind of work through the problem, just follow your roadmap. You've thought about this. You've thought about how the business will operate, and then the interview will be okay, let's look at this particular bucket that you just called out. So since you already have kind of this roadmap in your mind, just stay on topic, and that's it'll be pretty the case is going to be incremental in terms of how you walk through it. So it'll really help you in terms of getting to the end state. Take the time to write all the math out by hand. Again, don't feel pressure to just do all this calculations in your head. If you can, that's great, but yeah, no pressure for that at all. Again, making sure to just periodically sanity check your results and conclusions. that's really like an integral part of like our day-to-day job, just making sure like, if we have this like market that we've never sized before and then we get to a number, like, doesn't make sense. Like, we want to just test that you are also like consciously thinking of these like questions that we like always think about on a day-to-day basis. Don't panic when you don't know industry facts. Again, especially like our cases are very TMT focused. We don't expect you to like be a TMT guru before these cases. So like really just, it's fine. Again, ask the questions and then always remember that there's no right answer. We just want to hear how you're thinking about the process, and every candidate like really offers like different approaches that are, unique. And like in terms of, we all come from different experiences, and just being able to like rationalize something from, I've seen the market kind of trend this way, so I think it might be like this. Again, like it's just a collaborative process. There's no one right answer where if you get it, then you get it. If you don't, then, no, I didn't do well. That's like not a thing. So.
Annabelle hit the nail on the head on a lot of those. Stressing that last one, I've interviewed folks for the past 3 years. I've interviewed a lot of folks, and I've had a lot of cases that have arrived at the completely wrong answer that went way better and were better cases than cases that actually arrive at the right answer. Because I'm able to see folks' thought process. And in this example, right, you would arrived at half that market size. Let's say I have 3.6 billion on my sheet, but if you make a really strong case for a ramp to market share and say, hey, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that 40%, you're going to be off on at least that market size that I have on my page. But I'd love for that discourse, right? And I would much rather that than someone just be saying 40% because it's less than 50% and I like the number 40, right? That produces on page the right answer, but I'd much rather that sort of explanation and the discourse associated with it. With that, I'll send it back to Naman. We wish you all the best in this process, and we're very much looking forward to hopefully seeing a lot of your resumes come across. I know my desk for review, and hopefully we'll see you in some case interviews soon.
Amazing. That was a fantastic session. I know I enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else did as well. So like Toby and Annabelle mentioned, please do apply for these open roles at this incredible firm. Thanks everyone for joining today. Thanks for joining us for this special bonus episode. Don't forget, Altman Solon is hiring right now for 3 open roles across its offices: consultant, senior consultant, and manager. You can find the link to apply in the show notes. The application deadline is this Friday. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We'll see you next time.